When Mark Knoll first asked me this question, I was immediately struck by the fact that I had read nothing on the Victorian Jesus. In fact, I had read nothing substantial on Jesus in the many volumes of church history he had assigned me that ranged from the Reformation through the 20th century. And this was a particularly fascinating scholarly oversight because Jesus is an important character in Victorian England. We find many writers composing lives of Jesus, retelling the narrative of Jesus' life in various narrative formats. We find that novelists like Charles Kingsley offer the solution to both their narrative and character problems in the person of Jesus. We find writers like Mary Augusta Ward also obsessed with Jesus and who he is and what he means for British culture. And yet nobody had looked at Jesus specifically. Given this lack of scholarship on Jesus in the Victorian period, it seemed like a perfect area of research to consider the interaction of religion, literature, and history within Victorian England. There are a number of reasons why Jesus emerges as a significant personality in the 19th century. One of the most significant is what Colin Brown has described as the second great Christological crisis in church history, in which English deists and German idealists began to put pressure on traditional doctrines such as the Incarnation and the bodily resurrection. While these challenged the traditional understanding of Jesus as God incarnate, such thinking also drew incredible attention to Jesus, making him a subject for public interest and concern. The second important reason why Jesus emerges is the evangelical revival, which insists upon the individual believer's relationship to God. Jesus is understood as securing one's salvation through his death and resurrection. And while this creates all sorts of narrative problems in terms of putting Jesus in a subordinate role to the believer, it also puts a lot of emphasis on him and results in certain forms of devotion oriented around Jesus. The third important reason why Jesus emerges is the Tractarian movement. This revival of Catholic Church practice within the established church meant a revival of the liturgical year with its focus on things like Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, the Holy Week observances, and Easter, all of which are grounded in the specific life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The living out of this narrative of Jesus' life year after year drew even more devotional attention to him as a person and as a historical figure. And so these three combine to form sort of the perfect storm to foster great public interest in the identity and in the identity of Jesus for 19th century British culture. Many people are surprised to hear that Jesus even features as a significant personality in Victorian novels because he isn't in the novels of Charles Dickens. However, he does turn up in a lot of very popular novels from the 19th century. And it's the very strangeness of these appearances of Jesus that makes them so worthy of scholarly study. After all, realism does not typically lend itself to divine characters or the appearances of anything supernatural. And as such, when novelists decide to put Jesus into their novels, they have to experiment, both in terms of form and characterization. Now, these experiments do not always go well, but it's still fascinating in terms of what such experimentation tells us about how narratives work, about how characterization works, and about how Victorians understood Jesus, because the way they experiment with his character tells us a lot about their theological and personal preoccupations.